Imagine waking up one day and realizing that the person staring back at you in the mirror isn't entirely you. There's a hidden force, a silent puppeteer pulling the strings of your life without your knowledge. This invisible director isn't some external entity. It's part of you that you've locked away, buried deep within your psyche. It's what Carl Jung called the shadow. And it's been influencing your decisions, your relationships, and your entire life path without you even realizing it. I'm Roach, Mark Roach. Welcome to Transcendent, my YouTube channel where I share my journey around the world and through life, crossing the full spectrum of human life from high to low, as most people in American society define them. This channel is all about inspiring common people to find their power. Have you ever felt like you're driving through life with the handbrake on? You're putting in all this effort, but somehow you're not getting anywhere, or worse, you feel like you're damaging yourself in the process? That's exactly what happens when we ignore our shadow self. It's not what we face that haunts us, it's what we pretend doesn't exist. Let's dive into what this shadow really is. Imagine there's a dark room inside of you, a place where you've thrown and locked away everything you don't want to see about yourself. In this space live your repressed anger, your insecurities, your secret desires, and even your talents you never developed. This is what Jung referred to as the shadow. Now, don't get me wrong. The shadow isn't inherently evil. It's simply everything that's been rejected and hidden since childhood. Think about it. When you were a kid and you got angry and screamed, what did the adults around you say? Don't do that. Be polite. When you expressed yourself too freely, you might have heard, behave yourself. These messages were like bricks building the walls of your shadow. And over time, we learn to hide these parts of ourselves that haven't been accepted. This process creates an internal divide. What we show the world, our persona, and what we hide, which is our shadow. It's like we're all walking around with a dark box in the corner of our minds. Every time we feel uncomfortable, an uncomfortable emotion, or have a thought we consider ugly or wrong, we shove it into that box. At first, this seems like a quick and easy solution. But what happens when that box gets full? It overflows. And the things that we've hidden start to show up in unexpected ways. Maybe you have an outburst of anger during a simple discussion, or you experience a mental block when trying to make an important decision, or perhaps you just feel a general sense of dissatisfaction with life, even when everything seems to be fine on the surface. Let's look at a real-life example. Meet Jan. He's been working at the same company for years and has never asked for a raise, even though he knows he deserves one. Every time he thinks about talking to his boss, he hears an inner voice saying, "Better not. What if he thinks you're greedy?" That voice isn't just rationality speaking, it's fear that's been pushed into the shadow. Until Jan faces that fear, his shadow will keep making decisions for him. Or think about those difficult conversations we all avoid. How many times have you put off talking to someone about an important problem thinking you're avoiding conflict? And what usually happens? The problem grows and the conversations become unavoidable and even more difficult. This happens because the things we avoid confronting don't disappear. They accumulate like items in that dark box until there's no more room to run. But here's the thing. The shadow isn't until there's no more room to run. But here's the thing, the shadow isn't the villain in your story. It's the fact. In fact, it's an essential part of who you are. Jung used to say, one does not become enlightened because imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious. This means that freedom doesn't come from getting rid of the shadow, but from getting to know it. Because as long as you don't recognize what's hidden, it will keep making decisions for you. So how does the shadow show up in our daily lives? It's not always obvious. The shadow operates subtly but powerfully, influencing our decisions, relationships, even how we see ourselves. Think about the fear of failure. How many times have you declined a challenge or an opportunity because you were afraid you wouldn't be good enough? When this happens, it's not just caution. Most of the time, it's shadow work. This fear of not meeting the expectations might have formed in childhood due to excessive demands. You pushed it inside, but it didn't disappear. So when an opportunity for a new job, a bold project, or even public speaking comes along, the shadow steps in and whispers, "Better not. You might fail and be criticized." The shadow also shows up in our relationships. Imagine someone who always tries not to seem too demanding. They give in on small matters, don't express their desires, and often accept things they don't like just to avoid arguments. This behavior might seem like maturity or patience, but it's often the shadow and control. Over time, what happens? The accumulation of frustrations build up. Suddenly, an argument erupts out of nowhere, and the person doesn't even understand why they're so upset. But it wasn't out of nowhere. It was the result of everything that had been repressed. In the professional world, the shadow's influence is just as strong. Picture a colleague who has brilliant ideas during meetings but never shares them. They think, what if it's not a good idea? What if people judge me? This doubt keeps them silent. In the end, other colleagues present similar ideas and get recognized for them. And it feels like they're invisible, like they're never appreciated. But the truth is, they were the ones who hid themselves. The fear of being exposed, stored in the shadow. That was what made the decision for them. The shadow doesn't only show up in meetings. It often appears in our dreams and personal projects, holding back our progress. Take Carlos, for example. He dreams of starting his own business, but never takes the first step. Every time he thinks about it, the perfect excuse pops up. Now isn't the right time. I need to study more before I try. I'll do it later. At first, this seems like caution and even common sense. But over time, Carlos realizes that he never actually feels ready to begin. Why does this happen? Because his shadow is in control. Carlos doesn't realize that this voice of caution isn't from reason, but from an old memory. Perhaps from a time when he was criticized for not doing things perfectly. Today, he still tries to avoid making mistakes at any cost. By doing this, he protects himself from potential failure, but at the same time, he prevents his own growth. In the end, he stays stuck in an uncomfortable comfort zone, all because his shadow is making the decisions for him. These examples show how the shadow operates silently and invisibly. How many opportunities have you missed because you were afraid of failure? How many conversations have you postponed because you feared discomfort? And how many times have you stayed silent when you knew that there was something important that you had to say? All these situations have one thing in common: the shadow working behind the scenes. Maybe it's time to bring to light what's been hidden. Take a look at where you've been holding yourself back, where you've been letting fear make decisions for you. Ignoring what's in your shadow might seem like an effective short-term strategy, but the long-term cost is high. When you don't face what's hidden, it's like driving a car with the handbrake on. You might be putting in more effort, but you don't get anywhere. Or worse, you end up damaging the car. And that's exactly how it is in life. One of the first signs that the shadow is taking control is the feeling of stagnation. Relationships that seem to go nowhere, opportunities that pass you by, the goals that never leave the paper. This isn't the result of bad luck or lack of ability, but often the shadow is making decisions for you. Imagine someone who avoids asking for feedback at work because they're afraid of criticism. They might avoid discomfort in the short term, but over time their career stalls. Without feedback, they don't know where to improve, and consequently, they don't grow. Another effect of the shadow is emotional exhaustion. Every time you swallow an emotion, it doesn't disappear. What was repressed stays inside, and at some point, it overflows. This can manifest in outbursts of anger, anxiety attacks, or even physical symptoms like headaches, muscle tension, chronic pain. It's the body's way of trying to deal with what was ignored, what was neglected. You've probably experienced something like this after a full day of small frustrations. One final situation triggers a disproportionate reaction. It wasn't that single event, it was the accumulation of everything that had to be pushed into that shadow. In relationships, the cost of living without acknowledging the shadows is even more apparent. Imagine someone who never expresses their needs or for fear of being seen as being difficult. They give in to everything except what the other person wants and try to avoid any conflict. At first, this may seem like a strategy to maintain peace. But what happens next? Frustration, resentment, and often breakups, because no one can pretend that everything is okay forever. This person who never says, "I don't want this," eventually explodes. And the other person doesn't understand why, because from their perspective, everything always seems fine. The shadow also affects life's choices. How many times have you given up on an opportunity because you didn't feel ready? That feeling of inadequacy, which often shows up as "it's better to wait a little longer," is actually the shadow at work. Maybe it's a point in your life when you were told that you weren't good enough. And to avoid the pain of failure, you decided to avoid risky situations. The problem is, by avoiding risk, you also avoid growth. The ultimate cost of ignoring the shadow is the loss of autonomy. When you don't face your repressed parts, you're not in conscious control of your decisions. Instead, your choices are driven by fear, shame, and guilt that were hidden in the shadow. It's as if you're being guided by an invisible hand, and it's not yours. But here's the good news. This can be reversed. By looking at what's repressed, you regain control. The light of awareness dispels the darkness, and what once seemed like a monster reveals itself to be just a part of you that needs attention and care. So pay attention to what you're avoiding. Notice the unsaid no's, the postponed conversations, and the opportunities you keep leaving for later. All of these could be signs that your shadow is taking the wheel. Remember, as long as you don't face what you've hidden, it will continue to make decisions for you. If up until now you've realized that the shadow plays an invisible role in your choices, now is the time to understand how to regain control. It's not about eliminating the shadow, but bringing to light what was once unconscious or you were unaware of. When you recognize what's hidden, it loses the power to make decisions for you. So the first tool for doing this is to recognize your escapes. What are the conversations you keep putting off? Which situations do you prefer to avoid? When do you feel like drinking? When do you feel like taking a drag on that cigarette or overeating? Look at your daily routine and identify these moments. It might be the meeting you avoid, the "I'll deal with that later" excuse you keep repeating, or that phone call that you never make. Every time you postpone something, you're feeding the shadow. You don't have to resolve everything all at once. The key here is to notice where the escape is happening and keep track of it. Then the second step is to name these emotions that you're feeling associated with those. Often, what has been repressed is just an emotion that was never given a name. It might be anger, fear, sadness, could be shame. When you feel these emotions, the natural tendency is to push them away, to deny them, to neglect them. But when you observe them, feel them, and you give them a name, they lose their mystery and they lose their power over you. Try this. The next time you feel a strong emotion, stop for a moment and ask yourself, what emotion am I feeling right now? Name it. That's the first step to bringing it out of the shadow. Another powerful tool is to face one mini shadow every day. This means taking one small action that you would normally avoid. It doesn't have to be something grand or evil or dark. Be honest with yourself. It may be something very simple. Don't make it too complex. It could be starting with a conversation that you've been putting off. Maybe expressing an opinion in a meeting, or saying no to a request that you normally wouldn't accept out of pressure. Small actions lead to big changes. Each time you face a mini shadow, you build confidence to tackle bigger challenges. Now let's move on to a practical exercise. Think of a situation that you've been avoiding. Could be a decision you need to make, a conversation you've been dodging, or even a simple task you've been procrastinating, or identifying what's behind this avoidance. Is it a fear of making a mistake? Is it the discomfort of confrontation? Now that you have clarity, write down on a piece of paper what you're doing to it, about it today, to face this situation. One small step is enough. And maybe it's something you really did wrong, and you need to ask someone for forgiveness. Or maybe it's something that you didn't do and you need to forgive yourself. This is where everything comes together. Everything we've explored about the shadow, from its origin to its manifestations in everyday life, leads us to one essential question. Who's really in control of your choices? If you made it this far, you're no longer the person who started this journey, the person who was listening at the beginning of this video. If you really heard what I said here, you now understand that what you hide doesn't disappear. The shadow is not the villain. It's a call to consciousness. The more you ignore it, the more it finds ways to appear in postponed choices, unspoken conversations, the fears that hold you back. The key point here is responsibility. Because as long as you allow the hidden parts of yourself to make decisions for you, your life will be a reactive response to those unconscious impulses. You will be acting almost like a robot with these robotic patterns. But when you bring those parts to light, you reclaim your power to choose. Carl Jung reminds us that until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate. That's what's at stake here. Look at yourself. Look at yourself with courage. It's not about defeating the shadow, but integrating it. If there's one phrase that can close this reflection, it's this. It's not what you face that haunts you, it's what you pretend doesn't exist that haunts you. Everything that is repressed comes back, and you have the opportunity to decide if you will continue pretending not to see it, or if you will face what has always been there. Now, I want you to pause and reflect for a moment. How many times have you told yourself, I'll do it later, I need more time, I'm not ready yet? Maybe it was about starting a course, launching a personal project, or maybe accepting a bigger challenge at work. Was it really you making that decision, or was it your shadow acting on your behalf? I'm Mark Roach, wishing you all the best.